This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, a meaningful investment with strong rates. Invest in Israel Bonds at israelbonds.com.
Shalom from Tel Aviv. I'm Calev Ben-David, and welcome to Jewish World Weekly on I-24 News. Each week we focus on the latest news, issues, trends, and personalities concerning the diaspora, the global Jewish community. And we'll begin our program with our top 5 items from the Jewish world, presented by Nicole Tzedek. Nicole?
Thanks, Calev. Here are the top 5 items from the Jewish world this week. A group of Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives are trying to push a bill through Congress to rescind federal funding for colleges that host events promoting anti-Semitism. The proposed law comes in response to an extremely anti-Israel and anti-Zionist speech given by a student at the City University of New York Law School graduation last month. New York City police report a total of 100 anti-Jewish hate crimes since the start of 2023. The 6-month total is a drop from the 123 anti-Semitic attacks reported during the same period last year. Australian authorities open a probe into whether the Adas Israel Jewish School for Girls helped sex offender Malka Leifer to flee to Israel in 2008 after allegations emerged that she had abused students at the school. Leifer was extradited back to Australia in 2021 and convicted in April on 18 counts of sexual abuse. The Board of Deputies of British Jews condemns the proposed sale by a Belfast auction house later this month of a silver-plated pencil engraved with the initials AH. It's said to have been a gift to Adolf Hitler from Eva Braun. The board calls the sale, quote, distressing, disturbing, and hugely disrespectful to the families of Holocaust victims. Plus, a new museum opens celebrating the history and culture of the American Jewish community of Washington. The Capitol Museum is located in the historic building of the Adas Israel Synagogue, which opened in 1876 in the presence of then-President Ulysses S. Grant. Those are your top 5 items in the Jewish world this week. Back to you, Calev.
Thanks, Nicole. Some 35% of American Jews, that's slightly over 2.5 million, identify themselves as Reform Jews, making it by far the biggest religious Jewish denomination in the community. But the numbers don't tell the full story. There is, in fact, growing concern within the movement about its future, amid a drop in synagogue and Hebrew school attendance and a growing disaffection or disinterest even among younger congregants with the state of Israel. Our senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim attended a recent meeting of the Reform National Leadership in New York to discuss those issues, and he filed this report.
Reform Judaism is far and away the largest Jewish movement in the United States, but its leaders are sounding the alarm on a number of issues, including a growing distance between the movement and the state of Israel, and a deprioritizing of Jewish education among its young congregants. They gathered here in Manhattan last week to talk about how to recharge Reform Judaism.
Around 300 Reform rabbis and leaders came on relatively short notice to talk about what they say is an inflection point in the movement, with synagogue attendance and revenue heading down.
In honesty, we've been at inflection points pretty much throughout our 150 years as the Reform movement here in North America. And I think we're just at a moment where we want to strengthen all the bonds that hold us together, that hold the North American Jewish community to Israel, that holds us all together here in North America, and to think about the big questions of who we are as a global Jewish people. And what does it mean to be reformed is key.
We chose to identify on this conference on 3 broad central questions. 1, the distancing from Israel and Zionism. 2, the restoration of the proper balance between the universal impulses of Judaism and the Reform movement, and the particularistic impulses of Judaism. And then the third issue that is a critical issue for us in terms of the synagogues, the future of the synagogues, is what is our what is our theology and what is our religious practice and belief and rituals that is suitable and recharged and refreshed for the 21st century.
The conference featured keynote addresses and panel discussions, many of which focused on the identity of the reform movement, which has often come to be identified by the concept of tikkun olam, or repairing the world. Critics say it's simply left-wing social justice politics wrapped up in Judaism, while proponents say it reflects Jewish values, if not traditional practice.
Our job as Reformed Jews is to keep Judaism relevant. I could just say it's been the job of rabbis for thousands of years to do that. So we're doing our job. The Jewish community wasn't ready for women rabbis. We said over 50 years ago, it's time. The Jewish community was certainly thinking that we couldn't make changes to liturgy or how we observe. We've made those changes out of deep commitment, not out of making it simpler to be Jewish, but how to make it more meaningful. So I don't think that change is something to disparage. And I think we haven't strayed from, we've strayed to Judaism.
First of all, social justice is important for all Jews. It should be important for all Jews. It exists from the very origins of Judaism. And so what we need to do in the modern world, and what our movement needs to do, is to understand that one flows out of the other. And social justice, universal impulses need to be grounded in the centrality of Jewish people.
Well, the leaders we spoke with here say it's not about rebooting or retreating from Reform Judaism. It's about recharging it. Reporting from the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in Manhattan, Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.
And Mike Wagenheim also spoke last week in New York at the Besheva conference with Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amichai Shikli, on the subject of anti-Semitism and the minister's relationship with elements of the U.S. Reform Jewish community.
One of the struggles the Biden White House had when releasing its recent plan to combat anti-Semitism was how to actually define anti-Semitism. Well, that same problem exists in Israel. And here at the Jerusalem conference in New York on Sunday, I spoke with Amichai Shikli, the minister for this government in charge of the struggle against anti-Semitism.
The main anti-Semitism that we see today, it is an attempt to deny the right of the Jewish people to have their own sovereign state.
But the other major portion of Shikli's ministerial portfolio involves diaspora affairs, and he recently put together a plan to forward $40 million from Israel's budget to North American Jewish schools, specifically to train the next generation of educators.
If you don't have Jewish and Zionist education, it is very hard to stand strong against this accusation. It is very hard to stand and fight for the truth if you don't know the history.
Now, of course, it's quite difficult to connect with American Jewry circumventing the Reform Jewish movement, a movement that Shikli has been quite critical of in the past and even in his role as the current Minister of Diaspora Affairs. I asked him if there is a path forward between him and the Reform movement in the U.S.
I'm not suggesting that the entire Reform movement is anti-Zionist, and I never said it, but you can see that some segments of it do go back to the origin of the movement as a counter-national movement.
And Mike also spoke with one of the most prominent American Jewish politicians in Washington, the Democratic Senator from Maryland, Ben Cardin, son of the noted American Jewish activist Shoshana Cardin. The senator, who has announced that this is his final term in Congress, discussed anti-Semitism and how Jewish values have informed his own life.
I think those values of tikkun olam, tzedakah, have been my guideposts throughout my legislative career. I've always tried to make this world a better place and help those that are less fortunate. And it really started with my Jewish background and the values that I learned in my home. I was pleased to see the Biden administration come out with that comprehensive plan. It's very clear that everyone needs to be together on this, all the agencies of government working with the private sector. We can never normalize anti-Semitism or trivialize anti-Semitism. And I think the recommendations that are made there to strengthen the coalitions with other marginal groups, to show leadership against any act of anti-Semitism.
Still to come on Jewish World Weekly, on our Jewish Forum segment, we'll discuss whether Judaism is compatible with trans. Stay with us. Welcome back to Jewish World Weekly. Now, few issues seem to have generated as much passionate debate recently in America as those dealing with the trans community. And that discord is not limited to the U.S. For example, a talk here in Tel Aviv recently by American Jewish author Abigail Shrier, who has written critically on what she calls the, quote, transgender craze, was met by protests that forced the rescheduling and relocation of the event. Within that broader discussion, though, is the sensitive and complex question of how Judaism and Jewish communities, especially those on the more observant spectrum, should relate to the trans issue and community. So in this week's Jewish Forum, we ask, are Judaism and trans compatible? Let me stress that this is not a debate on the human rights and equal protection under law of the trans community, which we take as a given. It is intended as a dialogue, and I hope a respectful one, specifically on the community as it relates to Jewish tradition, however one defines that. And joining us, we have Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, scholar in residence, trans and queer Jewish studies at New York's Beit Simchat Torah Synagogue. He's in our studio here. We have from New York, Abby Stein, writer, educator, and ultra-Orthodox transgender activist, Columbia University, joining us, as I said, from New York. Also from New York, we have Rabbi Avi Shafran, columnist for Ami Magazine and director of public affairs, Agudat Israel of America. And Rabbi Moskowitz, I will start with you. You thought, I'm sure, long and hard on this issue. Are Judaism and trans compatible?
Religion that God intends to have with the Jewish people, where the Torah contains the details of that relationship. There are Jews who are trans, and I think Judaism, more than any other character trait, prides itself in the pursuit of truth. And so asking a person who's trans to deny who they are as a prerequisite to be in relationship with the divine, I think runs counter to our tradition. There's a meta question about where gender lies, and what about it is essential within our tradition. God certainly has gendered attributes. God doesn't have a body. We have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice. And all of those things in the world of ideas are very interesting. But practically, there are people who are looking to rabbis and clergy for advice on how to be the most authentic and genuine version of themselves in relationship to the divine. Because we have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice, the current kind of standard is trying to explore what's at stake at each intersection to be affirming and validating of one's identity in these spaces. So just very quickly, for example, where a person sits on what side of the mechitza is different in terms of gender presentation than perhaps getting called up to the Torah, right, which is a function of, right? So as opposed to being counted in a minyan. So these are the questions that we need to be exploring with tremendous sensitivity. Okay. But there is no way for a person to not be welcome within the Jewish community for just being who they are.
All right, let me go to Rabbi Shafran, who I know has expressed a different view, as is Agudat Israel, which represents a sizable part of the observant Jewish community. Your response, Rabbi?
Well, it's clear that there are people who are deeply conflicted about their gender identities, and we and I should feel nothing but compassion and understanding for them. They face challenges that the rest of us do not face, and we have to recognize and respect that fact. At the same time, though, the Torah is unequivocal about the fact that being born in a male body requires living the life of a male, even if it's uncomfortable, and that being born female entails living as a woman. There's, of course, the Talmudic discussion of indeterminate sex, what's called intersex today, but that's really not, it's a very rare occurrence and not really pertinent to the larger issue here. Basically, Judaism does not allow, and it's clear in the Torah, does not allow a man to undertake the guise, whether it's in clothing or practice, and certainly not to take radical steps of altering his biology and his physiology to present himself as a woman, and vice versa. So these are things that there's a dichotomy in the world today of how to express one's spirituality, and if one is going to be focused on self-fulfillment as it's understood in the world today, that to live a meaningful life means to live a life where I feel comfortable, then that's not Judaism. Judaism sometimes requires discomfort, and this is the essence of being a determined and dedicated Jew, to be willing to do things that may not sit well or feel well, or even go against the grain of a person. And I think that the trans community has to understand that Judaism and the celebration of their cause are incompatible.
All right. Well, let me go to Abby. And Abby, in your own life, we've heard two very different views. In your own life, you've contended or dealt with both of these kind of views. So your response.
Let me start by saying I want to. There's a lot to say, but I want to start by kind of setting the tone a bit. First, let me say I need to say something to Rabbi Shafran. I'm surprised to hear an Ashkenazi Orthodox rabbi ignore Shulchan Aruch, like the whole cross-dressing thing. The Ramah, I would say the Remu in our Yiddish pronunciation, or the Ramah, Rabbi Moses Isserlis, literally throws the whole thing out the window. In Hilchos Purim, he clearly states that cross-dressing for the sake of someone's happiness, is allowed. He goes as far as to say that it's only forbidden when someone does it for the sake of adultery. Literally, he doesn't just say it's allowed if it brings you happiness. He says it's the only time it's forbidden. And Rashi already in Vayikra said the exact same thing. It is only forbidden if you do it for the sake of adultery, which is a whole separate conversation. But I want to step back for a second. I don't like how this conversation is being framed. There is a joke that I heard a lot, even growing up in the Hasidic community, where people said that certain Orthodox communities have found solutions for everything. The beauty, and I'm saying this truly with respect and beauty, of the Talmud is that when it came to people not being able to go outside because they can't carry anything outside on Shabbat, we found a way. It came to people losing money on Shabbat, we found a way to have your company open on Shabbat. It came to people losing money on Passover, we found a way to do that. Somehow there are certain communities that can't find solutions for two main things. For agunot, women who can't get a get, who can't get a religious divorce, and for the LGBTQ community. The reason I'm saying this and why I think it's so important is because this conversation is being said as if they are two legitimate ways of people who really want to find a place for the LGBT community in Judaism, but what can we do? The Torah wouldn't allow us to do that. When in reality, if there's a will, there is a way. The question here isn't whether there's a place for Judaism, for trans people within Judaism. That's a stupid question. It's a ridiculous question, not anymore. It doesn't make any more sense than whether to say, is there a place for Jews as a whole to have human rights? We had people throughout history say that as well. It's not a conversation.
Well, okay. I do want, because I want to give you all a chance to respond. Rabbi Shafran, I'm going to go straight to you. If there's a will, there's a way. Your response to that?
I think that there's a major distinction between economic, financial dealings, where there are ways of getting around things because it's all dependent on contractual law, like selling one's chametz on Pesach, and issues that might be put into the category of perhaps morality. There is no tradition whatsoever of bending on such things. To bring up the Ramah on Purim is really risible, because he's talking about one very specific use of cross-dressing, namely in a play where everybody knows that's what's going on. And even though he does reference, indeed, as Abby said, adultery, as Rashi does, the preponderance of halakhic authorities say that the cross-dressing, and most certainly no one says that surgery of any sort is permitted by any means in order to resemble the opposite sex. So I think that, even though Abby is speaking very passionately, she is misleading your viewers by insinuating that there's a possibility of accepting. Now, Jews, of course we accept trans Jews as Jews. Of course, we have every responsibility to every Jew, no matter what he or she does or how he or she presents himself or herself, every responsibility to love that person and to care about that person and to help that person. But we're not talking, I'd like not talk about people, but rather about things, ideas.
Okay, so yes, I understand that. So
the idea of acting as the opposite sex is totally against everything that Judaism stands for.
All right, let me go to Rabbi Moskowitz on that. And look, the Jewish tradition does deal very specifically with, for better or worse, what you say, biological issues or female biology. So Rabbi Moskowitz, your response.
Sure. I think just to distill this down and to not oversimplify it, but either we believe that trans folks are the gender that they tell us that they are, in which case they're wearing gender-affirming clothing, or not. And so the Rav, I've appreciated his work for a long time as a exceedingly articulate spokesperson for the Haredi world, believes that this is a function of immorality, that a person is misrepresenting themselves to the world because it's not possible for a person to be assigned one gender to transition to another. I don't see this as a pagam in immorality, because it's not necessarily related to any sort of action. You have, let's say, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old who says, "Tati, mommy, it's not pshat as I'm a girl, I'm a boy." I don't see that as an immoral declaration. And my Rebbe in Yeshiva also acknowledged that we need to figure out better ways of being able to be supportive, but science-based medicine today informs halacha, and the standard approach is that this is much more biological, the trans experience, than anything else. So I think that at the end of the day, either we think that a person can be holy and acknowledge that they're trans, or we say it's not shaykh, and in which case then it's not, we're not even having the same conversation. Right. So that's all.
All right. Well, I want to go to Abby, because Abby, of course, these are questions that you've had to deal with in the course of your life, and I want to hear about your response to this and your resolutions on this.
I need to respond to obviously what was said. Like, we don't want to talk about people. Rabbi Shafran says we don't want to talk about people, we want to talk about ideas. We can't do that. It's literally impossible. In Judaism, we recognize that a life of a person comes before almost anything and everything else. And yes, I've heard people who are going to try to say that trans people fall into the 3 worst sins that you can do. But if you really believe that, I have no conversation to have with someone, because this isn't a question of can we live openly as trans people, or do we just choose to live a different way? We can't. It is who we are, and this is a conversation about people. This is a conversation. It's a matter of life or death, quite literally. It's a matter of, can we live, can we find a way to live within our communities? And I do need to say as well, because there have been throughout history, there have been rabbis, including not so long ago, whether like the one tshuva that everyone talks about, Tzitz Eliezer, a rabbi in Jerusalem, who literally said, an Orthodox rabbi, quite certainly was Haredi as well, who claimed that Judaism doesn't talk about chromosomes. Judaism doesn't talk about identity. Judaism mostly actually talks about secondary sex characteristics to determine someone's sex. Judaism talks about 2 whole gender categories, Saris and Eilinus, which are something that someone is not born with, something that happens throughout history. The point of all of that is we can sit here and dissect the whole day the exact details, the exact nuances of exactly what texts throughout history have spoken about, what modern texts are spoken about. Judaism is a living religion. It's not something that happened. It is something that constantly evolves with the reality. And I literally just quoted a text from Degel Machne Ephraim, the grandson of the founder of the Hasidic movement, who said the exact same thing. Every generation we have the interpretation of the Torah that works with us. That is the question here. Do we want to look at trans people and go, these are our people, these are people we want to embrace? That there is no question that there is ways not just to accept us, but to celebrate us as part of the Jewish community.
Okay, Abby, I think we'll have to end at that moment. I did say I hoped for a respectful dialogue, and I think that's what we had, and a very informed one as well. I thank Rabbi Avi Shafran, Rabbi Mark Moskowitz, and Mike Moskowitz, Rabbi Moskowitz, and Abby Stein for joining us on Jewish World Weekly. Thank you, all of you. And still to come, we'll take a look back at the legacy of Iraq's Farhud pogrom. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Jewish World Weekly. The wave of anti-Semitism that decimated the Jews of Europe during World War II is well known and documented. Less so, though, is how those tides of hate spread to other parts of the world and incited incidents elsewhere, including here in the Middle East. This includes the Farhud, a pogrom that erupted in June 1941 against the Jews of Iraq, sparked by the conflict between Nazi-sympathizing Arab nationalists and British colonial forces. The Farhud eventually led to an exodus of Iraqi Jews, and And today, still, their descendants are fighting for greater recognition of that devastating chapter. In This Week in Jewish History, we focus on the Farhud in this report from correspondent Jeremy Renou and producer Fabio Shapiro.
Before the ceremony, Iraqi Jewish families show their old photos from a bygone era. 82 years later, the descendants of the Iraqi Jewish community commemorate the Farhud, the pogrom in which 200 Iraqi Jews were killed and several hundred were wounded on June 1st and 2nd, 1941. At the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center in Israel, nearly 100 of them celebrate their roots and commemorate the tragic fate of their community, an opportunity to transmit their memory and share testimonies.
We took the road to see the horses, which were in the box, with my father and 2 other people. On the way back, we took a minibus. People forced us to stop, opened the front door, grabbed my father's friend and started beating him. My father understood the situation and managed to flee through the window of the minibus. I tried to follow him, but I couldn't. My foot got stuck. The driver saw the riots and starts. Because I was stuck, I survived the Farhud. I haven't seen my father since that day.
For more than 5,000 years, Jews lived in harmony in Iraq. Integrated into local communities, they occupied all classes of society. It was not until the 20th century that the situation became more complicated. In 1941, a group of pro-Nazi Iraqi soldiers led by Rashid Ali al-Gailani seized power after a coup. They dominated the country for several months until the British regained control. The power transition was chaotic, with extremist nationalist groups roaming the capital, Baghdad. London's victory came on the eve of the Shavuot holiday, which was being celebrated by the Iraqi Jews as the British seized the city. The celebrations were seen as anti-patriotic by many Iraqis and used as pretext to attack the Jews and put them into ghettos, a trauma translated into art.
Life was very hard in the ghetto. First, there was hunger. Women and men were separated. Men were sent to forced labor for 12 hours a day, taking care of trees. Sometimes we even had our water access cut off.
The following years were difficult for the Iraqi Jews. 135,000 of them had to leave the country in 1951. Only 15,000 of them remain there now, mostly the wealthiest of the community. For them, the 50s and 70s remain a good memory.
Before they hung up all the 9 Jews, in Baghdad they lived very well in the 60s. Late 50s, 60s, they lived very well. I left 1951 with all the immigration that went to Israel. And for my large house, to go to a tent, it's a big shock for my parents. For me, I was a kid.
The majority of Iraqi Jews arrived in Israel under harsh conditions. Refugee camps were set up across the country to accommodate them. Their history and their traditions were downgraded. For Eli Dalal, a member of the Israeli parliament of Iraqi origin and guest at the ceremony, these kinds of events are essential.
The recognition of the Iraqi community and its suffering is unfortunately recent in Israel. We are organizing a day of commemoration in the Knesset, which would also be observed in schools across the country. It should be remembered. Until 10 years ago, there was not a sentence about Iraqi Jews and Farhud in school textbooks.
82 years after the anti-Jewish pogroms in Baghdad, 600,000 Israelis are descendant from Iraqi Jews, heirs to 1,000-year-old history. Many of them want to keep fighting for recognition of their suffering and their cultural richness.
It's one of the most storied episodes in the history of the founding of Israel. The 1947 voyage of the ship Exodus that carried 4,500 Jewish refugees from post-Holocaust Europe to then British-blockaded Mandatory Palestine. Their struggle put the Zionist cause on the world's headlines and inspired the best-selling book and hit movie Exodus. The ship set sail from the French Mediterranean port of Sète, and last week a special ceremony was held there to mark the 76th anniversary of its departure. More on that in this report from Hannah Papiashvili and Aurelia Roddy.
76 years later, it is here in Sète where it all began. A ceremony took place this week in homage to the Exodus, with the laying of commemorative plaques on the port tracks, a tribute that is part of the duty of memory.
It's a fundamental step to engrave in stone a trace of the Exodus. The story can serve as a reminder and a tool to fight racism and antisemitisms that are on the rise again in France and in Europe. It's absolutely fundamental.
Among the guests, some came directly from Israel, survivors and children of survivors, as if to retrace the footsteps of their exile. They were 4,554 Holocaust survivors, children, women, and men from all over Europe who embarked clandestinely on the Exodus. Among them, Penina Gavish. July 11th, 1947, she was in this port of Set. She was barely 13 years old, and here she is accompanied by her grandson.
I would never have thought that so many people would come to this ceremony. I'm very moved to see everyone. It was nighttime when we arrived in July 1947. We had to climb one by one on the boat, very slowly, lest it would capsize. I remember there were a lot of small trucks, and we had to make believe that it was boxes inside and not human beings who embarked.
Bernard Marx also came to pass on his story, more particularly that of his father, who, thanks to his naval experience, was able to sail the boat.
If I'm here today, it's to pay tribute to my father, Commissioner Labouté, who did some incredible things. He was a very humble man and did this because he didn't want Jews who came from concentration camps to have nowhere to go. So he's now part of the history of the Exodus. And he's also the one who brought the boat to Haifa. He was an exceptional person and devoted himself to this trip. So I'm paying tribute to him.
On site, many local and community elected officials attend the event, but also those from the Israeli embassy in France. The Exodus is tragically part of the creation of the young state.
The story of Exodus, the story of the exit of the Jewish people from Europe is one of the anchors of the story of the establishment of the country and of the exit of the Jewish people from Europe after the Shoah. This ceremony was, first of all, wonderful ceremony, and it's very important for us at the state that those survivors and this story is remembered here in France. And it's also important for us as an embassy because it strengthens the ties between Israel and France.
During the ceremony, it is also the courage of Laurent Labouté which is celebrated. Without this commissioner who provided false papers, the boat would never have been able to leave the port. He is recognized as righteous among the nations.
France was seeking redemption for itself in 1947, and it was able to do so through these types of institutions, through these people like Commissioner Labouté, who helped these men and women coming from the death camps.
Most of the visitors coming to Set will be able to understand, and for some probably even discover, the story of this boat that ultimately escaped Europe for a promised land that was difficult to reach.
From now on, the epic of the Exodus 47 is engraved forever in this small port of Set. It becomes an eternal way to tell the story of those who, after having lived through the unspeakable, were ready to die to reach the land of Israel.
The Exodus. Still to come on Jewish World Weekly. A new Italian film tells the true story, the incredible true story, of an Italian Jewish boy who was kidnapped from his family by the Catholic Church. We'll take a closer look at that. Stay with us on Jewish World Weekly. Welcome back to Jewish World Weekly. It's one of the most shocking episodes in the difficult history of the Catholic Church's relationship with the Jewish people. In 1858, police officials in Bologna, then part of the Papal States controlled by the Vatican, entered the home of the Italian Jewish Mortara family and seized their 6-year-old son, Edgardo. They said that because a former maid of the family had secretly baptized the boy, they were taking him away to be raised by the church as a Catholic. The case spurred international outrage and condemnation. But then Pope Pius IX adamantly refused to return Edgardo to his family. And the story does not have a happy ending, at least from the Jewish perspective. Brought up in the custodianship of the church, Edgardo eventually became a Catholic priest. The Mortara case is now the subject of a new critically acclaimed Italian film by noted director Marco Bellocchio, which is titled Rapito, or Kidnapped. Here's a bit of the film.
Signor Mortara, suo figlio Edgardo è stato battezzato con l'ordine di prendere. Cosa? Portarlo via.
Vogliono portarcelo via!
Tutto è stato fatto in piena regola, secondo il diritto canonico.
Non ho testa, papà.
Ti faranno niente.
Si può perdere tutto, ma non un'anima che Cristo ha conquistato con il suo sangue.
Questo creerà nuove tensioni.
Io sono il Papa. Solo a Dio devo rispondere.
La storia è andata su tutti i giornali. Ha fatto il giro del mondo, è arrivata fino in America.
Suo figlio non è più ebreo, signora. È cristiano.
Il figlio è ebreo.
Joining us now for more from Rome is David Kurtzer, Dupuy University professor of social science at Brown University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. And Professor Kurtzer, thank you for joining us. I think the biggest problem a modern reader or a modern audience would have in understanding this story is just how is it even possible for the Vatican to get away with kidnapping successfully a Jewish child from his family? Maybe you could expound on that.
Well, for 1,000 years, the popes ruled as so-called pope kings. So there were also civil leaders or rulers in the papal states, which occupied a broad swath of Italy from Rome up through Bologna in the north. And so they had police powers in the lands they controlled. So it was church policy that if a Jewish child was baptized, even secretly, even without the parents' knowledge or certainly consent, that the child was considered then Catholic and could not, according to church doctrine, be raised by a Jewish family, and so had to be removed from his or her family. And there are many, many such cases in the past over the centuries. What was different about the Mortara case in 1858 is the Jews were increasingly being given equal rights in Europe. And so the Jews were beginning to be able to have some political power in organizing international protest.
Right, let's talk about that protest because it was a huge deal at the time, but in the modern era, I think it's this episode is somewhat overlooked.
Well, I think until my book came out, the English version came out in 1997, there had never been really a book about the case, explaining the case. And there were, some Jewish historians who knew about it, but very few others did. And so this recent film has just come out in Italy. It probably caused more conversation about it than certainly in Italy than's ever happened. And in fact, it had a major impact. The event, it wasn't just a kind of matter of Jewish history. It really had a big impact on Italian history because it was used by the French emperor at the time, Napoleon III, and by people like Cavour, the architects of Italian unification, to argue for the end of the church temporal power and the unification of Italy under a civil ruler.
Right. Now, I don't want to play spoiler for those who want to see the movie when it comes out. It's early in English, and I'm sure it will, or even here, but it does not have a happy ending. The boy, Edgardo, was kept by the church until he was, I guess, indoctrinated into Catholicism, became a priest even. Maybe talk about what his fate and what happened to him, especially in relation to the family that he was kidnapped from.
Well, Edgardo Mortara was from a Jewish family in Bologna, which was part of the Papal States. And one night in June of 1858, the police came and told the Mortara family that they had the order from the local inquisitor, because there was still an inquisition in 1858, to take the child from them. And you wouldn't at the time tell them exactly, why or what had happened, but they ultimately find out that the inquisitor had ordered the taking of the child, and he was sent to an institution called the House of the Catechumens that had been set up in Rome back in the 16th century for the conversion of Jews. And the family then over the next months desperately tried to get him back, and the church and the Pope himself, who got involved in kind of firsthand, became directly involved and decided, no, according to church doctrine, the child was now Catholic and could not be returned to Jewish family.
Right. Let's talk about that Pope, Pius IX. I should note that with all the publicity of the Vatican, this new film has gotten, the Vatican did sort of make a statement in its newspaper. In an editorial, it said that this case, quote, could no longer repeat itself because of the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s, and which, quote, helped change the perspective of those times under which every baptized child had to be educated Catholic, even against the will of his parents. That's an explanation, Professor. It's not really an apology for what happened.
No, I mean, in fact, the John Paul II, as part of the second millennium celebrations in 2000, had the Pope Pius IX beatified and on the way to sainthood, and the Mortara family and the Jewish community in Rome protested this, for that reason. Of course, part of the reason that something like this couldn't happen again is the church no longer has police power. So it is, however, true. This actually did surprise me that according to canon law still today, it's appropriate and even recommended for a good Catholic to baptize a child, non-Catholic child, including a Jewish child, if that child is thought to be in danger of death, and even without the permission of the parents. So, of course, they can't be then taken by the police away from the parents, but this is still part of church doctrine.
Right. I'm just going to comment. There was a comment in one of the papers in Italy by Rome's current chief rabbi saying the official defenses of Pius IX and his persecutory apparatus that are surfacing these days from many parts of the Catholic world are, if not astonishing, at least worrying. What's you agree with that?
Well, I think there is a concern that in the church today, there is a kind of conservative faction for whom the church went wrong with the Second Vatican Council, and with the kind of agreeing to treat Jews with respect and kind of equality. So I've run into that more recently because I had a recent book on the Pope Pius XII and his silence during the Holocaust. And one sees, if you go on Twitter, for example, many tweets which say Pius XII was the last real pope. There's been no real pope since then. The reason is after Pius XII is when the Second Vatican Council came, and Pope John the 23rd. And this, from the point of view of certain conservatives in the church, is where the church went wrong.
Right. Now, your book was critically acclaimed. I believe there was even reports Steven Spielberg was looking to make a movie about the story at one point, though it looks like this Italian film, maybe that won't happen. But let's talk about the reactions in the Jewish world, at least those who read your book, to learn that the Vatican was able to do that even back in the 1850s and 60s.
Well, first of all, I should say Spielberg still is interested in making a film, and Tony Kushner, who's written many of his recent films and a famous playwright for Angels in America and those other plays, has written a terrific screenplay based on my book. So we're still hoping that actually happens. But in terms of the Jewish community, yes, there's, I think people, for one thing, when they think of the Inquisition, they tend to think of, 1500s, 1600s. They don't realize that still in the middle of the 19th century, there was an Inquisition, and that in places, especially the Papal States where the Pope had police powers, it was enforced by the police. And so in the case of Edgardo Mortara, the Inquisitor of Bologna was able to send police to the home to forcibly seize their 6-year-old child. So I guess the main reaction I get from Jews, but not only Jews, even Catholics as well, that disbelief that this could still be happening in the middle of the 19th century.
Well, this story is shocking and unbelievable. I'll just mention again this film by Il Repito, the Italian film by Marco Bellocchio, a noted Italian film director, is garnering critical acclaim. And Professor David Kurtzer, thank you for joining us on I-24 News Jewish World Weekly.
My pleasure.
Now, there's an old saying that where you find two Jews, you'll find at least 3 synagogues. But you'll probably find even more Jewish youth movements. The Jewish community of Brazil's Sao Paulo numbers about 90,000. That's the second biggest in South America, and is home to a myriad of Jewish youth movements. But all of them get together once a year to compete in a joint sports event highlighting the unity of that community. Fabio Shapiro has that story.
Let the games begin. The Jewish Zionist Youth Council of São Paulo, Brazil, hosted another edition of the Intertnuot, a yearly competition between the Jewish youth movements of the city. The event includes sports contests as well as general knowledge quizzes on matters of Judaism and Israel.
This year's event has over 500 participants. The many movements got together to show the strength of the Brazilian Jewish community and youth. There is much to do, but it is very gratifying, mainly because this is an event that I love so much and participate in since the first year I was allowed to play.
Though events such as this are common in many communities of the Jewish diaspora, the Brazilian community differs by not only being represented by 1, 2, or 3 youth movements, but by 10, a token of the division of the São Paulo community. There are socialist and right-wing movements, Reform and Orthodox, Ashkenazi and Sephardi, Scouts and sportsmen. But despite all of their differences, the Intertnuot brings hope for a more united community.
Besides being a moment where we represent our movements, wear our shirts and sing our songs, this is also a crucial moment for us to connect, create links, and unite our potential, despite all of our differences. The Intertnuot also impacts all Jewish youth movements, showing the relevance of our Jewish informal education to Jewish communities worldwide.
This year's event marks its return after a 4-year hiatus due to COVID-19. The Jewish youth movement community is based on in-person activities and suffered massive losses of momentum during the period. Unity is key for the survival of the movements, and any help is welcome.
One of the best parts of the Intertnuot is to be here representing your movement, having fun and connecting with the community. I'm from Rio and came to Sao Paulo just to play.
This Intertnuot changed a lot in how people are dealing with the competition and how people are welcoming each other. Sincerely, I'm very happy with this Intertnuot.
The champion of this year's edition was Colônia da Cipe, affiliated with the reformed Netzer-Olami movement. But perhaps the true victory was surpassing the difficulties that divide this distinct community, the relentless mission of these youth leaders.
That's our program. Thank you for joining us on I-24 News' Jewish World Weekly.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, a meaningful investment with strong rates. Invest in Israel Bonds at Israel Bonds.